Along the northern coast of Norway, where mountains descend steeply into narrow fjords, the sea shapes everything. Villages are small and scattered, tucked into sheltered coves where the land allows it. Roads end. Boats take over. Out here, the water is not a backdrop to life. It is life. It was early autumn. The long, bright summer had only recently loosened its grip on the north. The days were still stretched thin into the evening, the light lingering longer than it did further south, even as the air had begun to turn colder. The season had shifted quietly, without announcement. The nights carried a different weight now. My name is Einar. I was 46 years old, and I had lived along this coast my entire life. My house sat just above the shoreline, close enough that I could hear the tide when the windows were open. My father had fished these waters before me. His father before him. I never really chose the sea. It simply became the shape my life took. I had a wife and 2 grown children. One had moved south for work. The other still lived nearby, stopping by when time allowed. Life had grown quieter in recent years, more predictable. I didn't mind that. There was comfort in routine. That evening, I left the harbour just after dusk. The village lights faded quickly behind me as I steered the boat deeper inside the fjord. The water narrowed between dark land masses, small islands and low skerries rising silently from the surface. Beneath the waterline lay shallow ridges, hidden rocks, and sudden changes in depth, hazards you learn to recognize by memory rather than by chart. My fishing boat was small, built for these conditions, narrow enough to slip through tight channels, steady enough to hold its course in shifting currents. A boat meant for slow movement and careful decisions, where knowing the water mattered more than speed. The weather was calm. The fjord lay dark and almost perfectly still, broken only by the gentle movement of the boat and the occasional ripple along the hull. I knew every island and skerry in this area, every shallow patch, every narrow passage that demanded respect. Fishing had been slow lately, not bad enough to worry about, but quiet, the kind of quiet that stretches time. I checked my gear, adjusted my position, and waited. For a long while, the night unfolded exactly as expected. The boat drifted slowly with the current, the engine idling low as I tended to the lines. The fjord remained calm, almost motionless, reflecting fragments of cloud and fading light. Fishing was still quiet, not unusually so, just one of those evenings where the sea seemed reluctant to give anything back. I had learned not to fight nights like this. You let them pass. You stayed patient. Sometimes the fish came late. Sometimes they didn't come at all. I leaned against the rail and let my thoughts wander. About small things. About home. About how quiet the house had become since the children moved away. My wife liked these evenings when I was out, said the silence suited her. I understood that. Silence had its own weight. That was when I noticed a light far out in the fjord. It wasn't anything that demanded attention, just a faint glow in the distance, barely more than a suggestion against the dark water. I assumed it was another fishing boat, someone else working the night, probably hoping for better luck than I was having. There was a quiet comfort in knowing I wasn't alone out there. I returned to my work. Time passed unevenly, as it often does at sea. Minutes stretched, then slipped by unnoticed. The clouds hung low, reflecting what little light remained back toward the water. Every now and then I glanced toward the distant glow, not because it seemed important, but because the eye is drawn to light in darkness. It stayed where it was, steady and calm. Fishing continued to be slow. At some point, without knowing exactly when, I realized I had begun to check the light's position more deliberately, measuring it against the islands, against the shape of the shoreline, making sure it hadn't drifted too close. It was nothing, I told myself, just another boat. Still, the awareness lingered. As the night wore on, I stopped thinking about the catch altogether. Fishing had never been about constant reward. Some nights gave generously, others didn't. You learned to accept both. I had a home waiting for me, a warm house, a familiar routine. In many ways, life had settled into something steady and good. The air had turned sharper now, not dramatically colder, but enough to be felt. A light wind brushed across the fjord, just strong enough to stir the surface without breaking it. The water remained calm beneath the boat, dark and steady, as if unaware of the change moving in above it. I pulled my jacket tighter and glanced at the sky. The clouds had lowered further, thick and uniform, pressing down on the fjord. The mountains on either side seemed to lean inward, their outlines softened by the dim light. It wasn't dangerous. Not yet. But it was uncomfortable enough to make the decision an easy one. I imagined heading home instead, tying up the boat, lighting the fire, sitting in the quiet warmth with a book, listening to the wind move around the house instead of feeling it on my skin. Another gust moved across the water. That settled it. I secured the lines and started the engine properly, letting it idle for a moment before turning the boat toward the familiar route back through the fjord. The bow cut steadily through the water as I set a comfortable pace for the trip home. That was when I noticed the light again. It was closer now, close enough that my eyes found it without effort. I slowed instinctively, easing back on the throttle as I studied it more carefully. It still seemed ordinary at first glance. Lights on the water were common enough. Then I realized it wasn't just one light. There were several, spaced apart, sitting higher above the water than I expected. The low clouds reflected their glow faintly, suggesting a darker mass behind them. Not clearly, not fully, just enough to register. I eased the engine down further and watched. The fjord was quiet. Too quiet. No engine noise carried across the water. No radio chatter. Nothing. Just the wind brushing the surface and the steady presence of the boat beneath my feet. As my eyes adjusted, the shape behind the lights became harder to ignore. Too long. Too broad. Even without detail, it felt wrong. Years on these waters had taught me what belonged here and what didn't. Nothing that large should have been moving through these narrow, treacherous passages. I stood there, engine idling, the boat barely moving, as the certainty settled in. It wasn't fear. It was recognition. Something was wrong. I didn't stay there long. The wind continued to brush across the fjord, steady now, and the cold had worked its way deeper into my hands. I turned the boat fully toward home, choosing a familiar route that required no hesitation. When I looked back again, the lights were gone. There was no gradual fading. No movement I could follow. Just empty water and the low, muted sky above it. I slowed once more, scanning the area carefully, searching for any trace of what I had seen. There was nothing. The fjord had returned to what it had always been, dark, calm, indifferent. The trip back felt longer than usual, though nothing about the route had changed. By the time I reached the harbour, the village lights were on, their reflections breaking the darkness into softer shapes. Inside the harbour office, the routine unfolded as it always did. A brief exchange, a nod, a comment about the season turning. "Did you see anyone else out there tonight?" I asked casually. The harbour master shook his head. "Not that I know of. Most came in before dark. At home, the house was quiet and warm. I lit the fire and sat by the window, looking out toward the fjord, now barely visible beyond the trees. Sleep came slowly. The next day, I went down to the small cafe by the pier. It was busy. Fishermen, dock workers, locals stopping in for lunch. I found a seat at a long table where a few older men were already eating, men shaped by years at sea. Someone asked how my night had been. I hadn't planned on telling anyone, but I did. I described the light, the shape, the certainty that something didn't belong. When I finished, one of the men leaned back slightly. "That wouldn't be the first time," he said. He told us about a large cargo ship, long ago, before modern navigation. It had entered the fjord at night, misjudged the route, and run aground where it had no place being. For hours it had sat there, lights burning, before the sea finally claimed it. "Same area," he said quietly. Outside, the harbour looked the same as it always had. Boats moving slowly, gulls circling overhead, the water calm and ordinary. And yet, some things don't disappear entirely. They linger, waiting,